Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Scheer Intelligence, and I'm having a guest back, Max Blumenthal, the editor, publisher, whatever, I don't remember, probably both, of the Grayzone. I consider it an incredibly vital publication, read it all the time, and crib from it from our own Scheer post. And I've been an admirer of his work. Well, actually, I knew him as a kid because his father was at the Washington Post, which is germane to our subject here. His mother was in charge of White House fellows in the Clinton administration. And then he's gone on to, I think, have a great career, wrote a very important book about Israel. I thought it was a very gutsy book. And at the time, I thought, wow, it's pretty controversial, but now it looks pretty lame, actually. I mean, the UN is way ahead of you, or at least the UN courts. And I don't think you alleged any genocide up to that point. I may be wrong. I haven't grabbed my copy off the bookshelf. But the reason I wanted to have you here is I don't want to say I'm freaked out because sometimes I think it's a comedy show, and then sometimes I'm very alarmed at what's happened to what is legacy media. It's not really legacy media because it's not even owned by the same people that owned it. I mean, I knew Kay Graham at the Washington Post, for example. Otis Chandler, the owner of the LA Times. I worked for him for 29 years. But now, the Washington Post is a different beast. It's owned by one of the richest, maybe the richest, or the second richest person in the world, Jeff Bezos. It just fired its editor. I'm not quite sure. She wasn't willing to make the cuts they wanted to make. But they went after you and your Wyatt Reed, your top editor, I guess, at Grayzone, in a way that I don't recall any major publication would have ever done in the worst days of the Cold War and McCarthyism or anything else. I mean, it really, I have to say, was unseemly, is the word I would use. I mean, it's hard to do red baiting because they always want to drag Russia into it, and it's now run by a guy who denounced communism and defeats the Communist Party in elections and so forth. So I don't know what the right word is. It's fear mongering, certainly, and it's an attempt to destroy freedom of the press. I kept thinking when I was reading the article about you and then reading your rejoinder, which we did post on SharePost, I was thinking about Tom Paine. For God's sake, you think of Tom Paine as this great defender of free speech, free press, and so forth. And even in his day, well, people said he was an agent of the French or agent of someone else, but they didn't go so far as to say he shouldn't have any free speech rights. In fact, they enshrine the free speech rights of folks like Tom Paine and our Constitution, whether they like what they had to say or not. So, I'm taking too much time for this introduction. Tell the people who haven't read your rejoinder or read the Washington Post article, which had to retract its opening uh, sentence. But why don't you just take it over now and explain what this happened? And I know for you it's not a joke, and for free press it's not a joke. But I guess it's the theater of the absurd. I just don't even get what's happened to our so-called mainstream media. And by the way, it's the main media a lot of people read because it's what Apple News features. They even have Newsweek up there and Time Magazine, and every morning I'm greeted to Apple News, and it's publication. I don't even know who owns these anymore. So tell me about the Washington Post and their attack on you and your publication, and on Wyatt Reed.
Well, this was in the Washington Post, a full page, essentially arguing without any facts or any argument that we should be criminalized, possibly jailed. The hook of the article is that Wyatt Reed, who I made managing editor, I don't even know what that means. It's just kind of like a title. I don't know what it entails. Wyatt, he does editing for me and he writes articles. And sometimes appears on our live stream to do analysis. 4 years ago, he publicly did some production and appearances on Press TV. Press TV is an Iranian state-backed international broadcaster that performs the same role as like the BBC or Al Jazeera. And he said that he was a producer for Press TV on his Twitter bio. This was not something he hid. I don't know what the facts of his arrangement were, what the details were with them, but you would assume if someone's doing production for them, and he was like covering things like Black Lives Matter protests and fairly mundane stuff. He was also covering them getting fees from CBS News, notorious enemy of the state, CBS News, for his coverage of Black Lives Matter. He was just out there start launching a journalistic career independently, and he had no involvement with the Grayzone except that we would like hang out together sometimes. He wasn't on staff. And so that's all they have in this Washington Post article. And with that, basically they got these hacked documents somehow, which according to the hacked documents show Wyatt Reed got some chump change for his work for Press TV. They first alleged that Wyatt violated US sanctions and therefore should be criminally punished, but they also tried to tie it to the Grayzone somehow because we have been busting Israel's propaganda, and to try to create the sense that Iran is actually influencing us and even paying us along with Russia, which they present no evidence for. And that's why we're a criminal outlet. The author, who's the head of the digital threats section at the Washington Post, we've been classified as a digital threat at the
This is
Grayzone.
Joseph Men.
Joseph Men
Is
is
that
the
actually a title? It's not a masthead title. Is it a title at a newspaper?
He said, I'm the digital threats editor at the Washington Post. He approached Wyatt Reed by email and demanded to speak to his lawyer. That's how he approached him, and accused him of violating U.S. sanctions in all sorts of ways, violating U.S. law in all sorts of ways. I'd never seen anything like that from another journalist. And it really speaks to the hostility that legacy media, which is itself a conduit for U.S. intelligence, has for us. This article clearly was related to our reporting and the investigations we've done on Israel's lies about October 7th. He mentions it repeatedly in the piece, falsely accuses us of misinformation, then says that there's some kind of overlap in funding between Wyatt Reed and the Grayzone, which makes no sense. That election season misinformation is a plague and a menace, even though nothing we've written has anything to do with the U.S. election, nor is it misinformation. And uses words like the complexity of misinformation. There's a caption underneath a photo of Vladimir Putin at the top of the article, which says that Russia is seeking new ways to influence Americans, insinuating that the Grayzone is one of those ways, even though there's no evidence provided at all in the article. And I mean, let's just state Russia and Iran do not fund the Grayzone. So what is the point of this article? It's obviously that the three-letter agencies are after us. They can't discredit us. They see that our audience is growing, while the audience of the Washington Post has shrunk by 50% in the past year. And now they're just seeking to finesse some kind of federal investigation. If you look at every source in this Washington Post article, those quoted by the demonstrably mendacious author Joseph Men, they're all funded by the US government, and they're intelligence fronts like the Atlantic Council Digital Forensic Research Lab, which is also funded by the United Arab Emirates, kind of adversary of Iran. Australian Strategic and Policy Institute is quoted there about the Solomon Islands. We've never written about the Solomon Islands. It's just like a complete non sequitur. But ASPI, this think tank that I just mentioned, is also funded by the US government and by arms manufacturers that are making tons of money off the Ukraine proxy war and off US military aid to Israel. Same with the Atlantic Council. The guy who got these hacked documents from about Press TV is a bizarre internet troll who has been described in his own emails and by others as an FBI informant. His name is Neil Rauhauser. Just a bizarre character. And down the line, in other words, every source is sponsored by the US government or a foreign government, and they're falsely accusing us of being government backed when we're not. And this is what passes for journalism in the Washington Post. That in itself should be a scandal. But what has happened is everyone who hates us, who wants to take us down because of our factual journalism, especially Zionists, the pro Israel lobby, has taken this article and declared matter of factly, without any evidence, that the Grayzone is funded by Iran and Russia. That was the headline in Israel's I-24. And they just state that without any evidence.
Can you sue over that?
Well, I'd have to go to Israel to sue them.
What
And I
about the
don't think I'll
people
be allowed
that?
into Israel at this point.
Yeah, I just was curious. I mean, because I say it's bizarre. It's not even a dark comedy. It's a stupid comedy. Except this is how you destroy freedom. I mean,
Yeah.
Hitler,
And that's what they're doing.
as it was pointed out, by Charlie Chaplin, was a comic figure until he wasn't a comic figure. And there's a way of looking. Look, first of all, I'm deadly opposed to any ad hominem attacks on any story, because you have to look at the story, see what they came up with, and I don't care whatever they did in their other life. The journalist or the writer, you judge it by its information. And so I personally, some of my best friends have worked for the CIA and the Voice of America and so forth. And I didn't ever say, okay, I'm not going to believe anything they tell me or analyze what they write or so forth. Here, I'm not even sure what the crime is that this Wyatt Reed did before he joined you, because what was wrong with doing some work for the Iranian media, or for RT or something, or anybody, or for Voice of America? I mean, the point is, what kind of journalism? What is that? Does it hold up? Does it work? Is it dishonest? And so we've lost the idea of attacking like your book. I brought up your book because I'd like to know. People tell me Max Blumenthal, blah blah blah. I say, read his book. What's wrong with the book? The book is a really solid piece of reporting, not a piece. It's a book, and it's real. And what take issue with it or don't take issue with. So the argument is shift now. That's why I bring up McCarthy. I bring up this baiting and so forth. Because I read the Washington Post article, there wasn't a single thing that the Grayzone is supposed to have done wrong journalistically. And so the ad hominem attack is the basis of the whole thing. And
Well, I
even
mean,
that
it's
they
not
had
just
to
ad hominem.
withdraw.
I mean, they're accusing us of committing crimes, of
Yeah.
violating U.S. sanctions, and they say so openly. That what since 2013 there have been these sanctions on Iran, and therefore anyone who's done work for Press TV who's an American could and should be jailed, and that could be hundreds of people. There have been no such sanctions like that vis-a-vis Russia, but hundreds and hundreds of Americans, prominent people, have had gigs at RT because it was one of the only places, one of the only international broadcasters where Americans could say certain things that were critical of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, you can't say it in the Washington Post. That's why so many young journalists who now work completely independently with no foreign backing at all, contributing to the Grayzone, had worked in the past at places like RT or Sputnik because it's the only place they could have worked where they in all of U.S. media. I mean, in all of it, because like progressive U.S. media, like the Nation, for example, or Truth Dig, they were hijacked and wound up supporting phony intelligence hoaxes like Russiagate, or supported the U.S. dirty war in Syria, or support the proxy war in Ukraine. So this is like this is. I mean, this is just it's just clear.
I know, but
And
I
I
want
think the
to,
author of this piece knows that. They're just trying to silence us because of the work
right, but
we've been doing to expose those wars, and that independent media is just taking on a more powerful role than it ever has, and the public trusts us more than the Washington Post.
okay, but I want to get at the heart of what I do think is the real danger here. Uh, with what is called legacy media, and as I say, like your father, I worked for legacy media. I worked for the LA Times for 29 years, and there were certain rules of disclosure, not always followed. and not always perfect, but there was certain understanding. And I think at the heart of it is a work of art, journalism, politics, or anything else should be criticized, evaluated on its own merits, and that smearing, ad hominem attack, bringing up the personality, bringing up background, and so forth should be irrelevant. I know I'm one of the first people to publish Cy Hirsch when I edited Ramparts magazine. And even in that day, well, the New York Times ran our stories that we had on Vietnam because they held up. They were factually accurate, they couldn't be disproved, and we were breaking news. What's happened now is because the news is uncomfortable, the truth is uncomfortable. We actually have to consider maybe U.S. policy is fundamentally wrong in basic ways. Maybe the world is more complex and so forth. So instead of challenging what you put in your book or what you have on Grayzone, they're going after this innuendo, this ad hominem attack. I keep bringing this up, and it's illogical in terms of the pursuit of truth or journalism. It's just irrational. And the fact is, as you point out, the Grayzone did excellent reporting on the horror, yes, I'll say it, of what happened in Israel and that first day that triggered this off. But the narrative was spun by the Israeli government, distorted, false information was offered, and they've had to back off on it. And so you had the courage to call them out. That's what journalists are supposed to do, whether it's Max Blumenthal or Tom Paine. That's what he did. And when we still had a First Amendment, even though Tom Paine could be a terrible irritant, and some people thought he was a traitor, they still protected Tom Paine. Probably was the person they had most in mind when they insisted on the First Amendment, the people who were resisting a constitution without that protection. So I want to get to the heart of the matter here, and that's the use of this idea of establishment journalism and who gets to define what misinformation is. The New York Times once again has disgraced itself on this very incident of the rapes and so forth that were claimed politically motivated, directed by Hamas, and yet their reporter is still reporting. And the question is really who gets to decide what's misinformation? And as I say, in the case of it's not even legacy journalism because it's not the same folks who used to own these papers who were concerned about keeping the loyalty of their readers and being honest with their readers. There was a market restraint. That's why I ended up working at the LA Times because Otis Chandler wanted to convince people out there it was not just a right wing publication, that you could have progressive journalists who could also do good journalism. And what's happening here is a lot of good journalism is done by the Grayzone. It's done by the Intercept, by a lot of people, much more, much more than what's called traditional journalism. That's really what they're going after. They want to claim the narrative and deny anyone the right to present an alternative view. Isn't that really what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, at the dawn of the Trump era, we saw the birth of this counter disinformation industry, what I would call and what others call the censorship industrial complex. And the intelligence agencies, the FBI basically laundered or concealed its fingerprints behind a series of think tanks like the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which was run out of the German Marshall Fund and created this phony Russian bot tracker called Hamilton 68, which was exposed as just completely fake, first by us or by me when I was writing for Alternet. And then, the Twitter files showed that even Twitter executives knew that it was fake and that they couldn't produce any data. But the whole point is to declare anything that contravenes the objectives of the US imperial regime to be misinformation, malinformation, or disinformation, or something in between. And that's what they did in this Washington Post article, Joseph Menn. He accused us of misinformation for my reporting in October that Israel killed its own citizens, many of its own citizens, on October 7th. That's been confirmed in a UN report that was released yesterday. An independent United Nations report confirmed that Israel enacted the Hannibal Directive on a mass scale, killed its own citizens knowing that they would die with tank shells and Apache helicopters after they had been taken captive by Hamas militants. This is something that I knew Israel did before, and I compiled evidence that they had done it along with testimony by Apache helicopter pilots. And, I've been proven right. Israeli media has reported on it. But this Washington Post reporter accuses us of misinformation for me reporting that. And his source is just Israelis. Israelis say that Max Blumenthal distorted the truth about October 7th. The greatest propagator of misinformation, as we know, Bob, are legacy corporate media outlets like the Washington Post, and they're doing it with us. That's why no one should take this article seriously, along with the fact that they never produced the evidence that we're some foreign intelligence weapon. I mean,
But we don't have the choice of taking it seriously because the way media is constructed now, it's not a bond between reader who plunks
right,
down 10 cents or a quarter to buy a paper. They can trust the New York Daily News or the New York Times or the Daily Worker or any other lefty or
right,
right wing publication. You now have this, it's bizarre. Apple, I thought it was going to be, AOL was going to control. They disappeared. You have something like Apple or Google News, and so the internet, and I've seen it because I've been doing publishing and writing on it now for some 20 years. Uh, Used to be pretty open, and it was a fresh breath of fresh air for democracy. Readers could find you, and then they could support you. They could send money like they do to Grayzone. They could send money like they do to Scheer Post or like they do to NPR, which this hopefully this will be broadcast on. But the fact of the matter is that's not what happens now. What happens is the internet is no longer free and open. It's tightly controlled, and the people who, like, for instance, what we're doing now, the people who will know about it, hear about it, is very limited. So there will be a crowd that will find it, but very often it's accidental. People amazingly write letters all the time. God, I found you. Why should it be so hard to find me? It
yeah,
wasn't 15 years ago. You wrote something interesting, people were reading it, they'd pass it around. So talk about that a little bit. And also, before we run out of time, I just got a notice from the Intercept as a reader or subscriber, and it said that now organizations like that can lose their tax exempt status because of the new rules that are being passed by Congress. I don't know if you want to go into that, but what I really want to talk about is how the idea that the internet, the positive thing about the internet, it was relatively wide open. It's been shut down tighter than a drum.
well, there was a point when the Grayzone's YouTube channel was exploding, and on or around May 15th, 2020, it stopped, and our subscribers started to come in with like a trickle, even though we had like 100,000 of them. What happened on May 15th, 2020? I mean, we analyzed the data. That's when a pandemic was declared, and new rules came in, putting the clamp down on any site that was publishing, that wasn't controlled, that wasn't corporate media, that could possibly say something that was slightly out of the ordinary, whether it related to COVID or foreign policy. And the point was to make it harder to find us. If you watch like a Grayzone video, like a clip from one of our live streams on YouTube, you'll immediately be taken somewhere else after the Grayzone video, away from the Grayzone channel. On Google, if you're in the United States on a IP address in the US, it's very difficult to find our articles if you Google them. If you're like in Central America, it's much easier because the algorithm is different. So mechanisms have been put in place to make it hard to find us or to find Scheer Post. But it's still not possible to control and suppress our influence. Like our live streams at the Grayzone since October 7th have been getting continuously over 10,000 views, which means over 100,000 views despite all of this suppression. And that's, if I was just some guy in a bar saying that Israel is pulling all of these hoaxes about mass sexual violence on October 7th, and I was clinically dissecting phony New York Times articles about it before people at the bar, then no one would care what I had to say. I wouldn't have to be attacked. But I have a 20-year record of writing books, doing documentaries, and amassing an audience, going across the country again and again, speaking to public audiences, and gaining the credibility that I think I deserve to analyze these issues. And so they have put a target on my back. They can't control me. They can't control so many independent outlets I can think of. And at the same time, their own audience is bleeding. Sally Busby, executive editor of the Washington Post, had to resign in disgrace abruptly last week. They're completely restructuring the Washington Post because they have no
What do you
idea
mean she
what
resigned in disgrace?
the publisher gathered all the employees. This was reported in Vanity Fair 2 Mondays ago.
I know. I'll let you tell that story, but it's not her disgrace.
It was her disgrace.
Oh, okay. Go
She
ahead.
was
Tell me.
forced to resign. I mean, she's basically fired. And he said, we have lost 50% of our audience in the past year. Nobody is reading us anymore. And, out of nowhere, the executive editor resigns. They're going to create like a third kind of Washington Post newsroom, which focuses on social media storytelling because no one reads their articles anymore. No one even watches their videos. And what they refuse to acknowledge is that people are sick of them just serving as stenographers for power, pushing Zionism, pushing big tech propaganda down people's throats, and doing the kind of attacks that they did on us, while people who are, highly politically educated, extremely motivated, or believe in social justice, want to affect political change, or sick of the two parties, these and their geriatric, warlike, bought off leadership, which is more and more Americans are turning to us. And more Americans trust comedians than they do politicians at this point. There's been poll after poll showing that. So we're looking at a complete crisis of confidence in the American establishment, from right, from left, across all ages. And so we're the targets, and they've failed to control us. They have failed to convince the public that we're evil. And so the only thing left for them to do is to do what they did to Julian Assange, which is to try to see us into a prison cell somewhere and lock us away, and then scare everybody else, crucify us in the town square so that everybody else gets so afraid that they won't do what we did, even though what we do is completely legal within the realm of the First Amendment and ethical within what I understand to be journalistic practice. What they do is something else. And they don't do disclosure, Bob. Like Greg Jaffe, Washington Post national security reporter, he's simultaneously a fellow at the Center for New American Security. What is that? It's the Democrats' version of Project for a New American Century. It's funded by the U.S. government, by the State Department, by the Pentagon, and by the arms manufacturers. You think that
Well,
guy's gonna? You think that guy's gonna challenge, bite the hand that feeds him? I don't think so.
well, about speaking of the hand that feeds him, it's ultimately Jeff Bezos
Oh yeah.
who actually used his own personal money, didn't even have to use Amazon to buy the Washington Post. And it's interesting because,
And what did he do? Sorry to interrupt, but what did he do a few days after buying the Post? He inked a deal with the CIA to host their cloud at Amazon for $600 million.
that's exactly the point I was going to make. But it's thanks for beating me to it. I have to give way to younger people here. But it's not just the cloud. I mean, the fact is that Google, Amazon, these companies are deeply entwined with the military-industrial complex that General Eisenhower, turned president, warned us about in his farewell address. They don't even teach that in schools anymore, or make much comment about it. But this idea of our having a war-driven economy, needing, therefore, not to prevent peace between in Ukraine and Russia, or to prevent ultimately any solution that would acknowledge the rights of Palestinians to full human rights. They actually benefit from this state of conflict in the world and exploiting it. And the interesting thing, I don't think if they can silence you, they can silence me. There still will be good journalists writing good stories. The Times of London had a very good story on the very subject that you're talking about, the whole rape thing just yesterday. There are other people will do it. The point is they won't have careers for long. That the really you have to go to the question of the ownership of media. I promised you I'd let you go after 30 minutes, so I'll cut it off. But I just what's really disturbing here is the illusion of a free press. And I've been at this a long time, 60 years or something or more, and I've never seen a worse situation because it's so deceptive. It's like people don't even know you. Oh, this is Newsweek. This is Time. No, it isn't. It's something different. It went through bankruptcy or change or different owners. And no, your Washington Post is not the sweat and blood of Phil Graham and and others. It's no, it's a toy of a Jeff Bezos, right? I don't know if you
Yeah.
have a last
I
comment.
mean, it's not just that it's the toy of Jeff Bezos. It's that, as you pointed out, it supports a particular culture of journalists and spits out anyone who understands the world from a non-imperialist perspective or is not willing to cultivate, to be an access journalist and focus on cultivating sources within the three-letter agencies and the military and serve as their stenographer. They ultimately cannot last. And then where do they work? Where is there to work in the United States? It's the perfect propaganda model. It's like there's nowhere for you to work or to be heard except RT. And now RT can't even operate inside the United States, as far as I know.
Yeah.
So, and if you work for them, well, you can never work again because the Washington Post will brand you persona non grata and speculate on whether you should be jailed.
Let me just conclude this though, but it's interesting. I start each morning reading the South China Morning Post, which is
Yeah.
owned by Alibaba, a
Yeah.
capitalist enterprise in China. They're learning, the Chinese, I think, are learning there's a much more efficient form of total. This was the argument between Orwell and Huxley, and Huxley said, no, it doesn't need the boot all the time. It can be done through seduction, control, you know, and I see it. I read. Actually, they have articles that are it's English language. It's gamed in Hong Kong, but it's worldwide available. They have some criticism. They have some people learn to play this game throughout the world. The fact of the matter is, and I want to go to the end just with that word, a non-imperial, because we were all raised to never think of the United States as possibly imperialistic, even though objectively looking at its number of bases and its power and its influence and control, there's no question. But the real information that they want to suppress is the notion of American innocence that they want to assert. That's really, as I see it, at the heart of this whole thing. And here, Biden and Trump are joined at the hip. Or when Trump said he's going to make America great, and Hillary Clinton said America's always been great. And the idea that this country can make mistakes but not do anything fundamentally wrong is the big issue in the world right now. Whether it's coming from India, Brazil, South Africa, people are objecting to that control of the narrative. And they're saying, no, that's what we mean by a multipolar world. They're saying we are actors in this world. We get to weigh in. That's what the UN is doing, pushing back. And I think that is really the issue. It's not, a non-imperialist view. It's any idea of challenging the virtue of American supremacy is the big taboo.
Yeah, I was attacked in the mainstream media attacks on me really started around Syria. And, this shouldn't have even concerned the United States, but the way that the United States wages war and exerts its imperial influence is often through proxies now, so that can do so without having its, being held accountable the same way that it was with what it did in Iraq, which is a purely American operation that decimated a country, destabilized an entire swath of the globe. In Syria, the U.S. was using jihadist death squads that it would arm covertly or semi-covertly, and then it had this white helmets operation of so-called rescuers who would pump out propaganda from the ground and accuse the Syrian government of chemical attacks. And I played a seminal role, along with many others, in exposing them as a front for British and U.S. intelligence. And I was attacked in the New York Review of Books by a journalist, Janine Di Giovanni, who has very close ties to the U.S. State Department, has gotten awards from the State Department, and she, claimed that, I think she claimed that the Grayzone was launched by Russia, was basically founded by the Russian government. There was no evidence whatsoever. The New York Review of Books, by the way, is sponsored almost entirely by George Soros and his operation. And Soros had been identified as early as 1991 in the Washington Post as an overt operator on behalf of U.S. intelligence, doing what the CIA used to do in secret. He was doing it openly and sponsoring regime change operations around the world to open up more post-Soviet countries to his business interests. And he had called for regime change in Syria in the pages of the New York Review of Books under his own name. So there was that attack. Then we started getting attacked by mainstream publications because at the Grayzone, we were busting the narrative that the Trump administration was putting out about a genocide of the Uyghur people in northwestern China in order to ramp up conflict with China, justify sanctions. And we clinically dismantled this narrative, which wasn't to say that Uyghur people haven't faced repression there, but we can see what a facile narrative that was when the U.S. is denying that genocide is being committed in Gaza, when it's being live streamed right before our eyes, and we're seeing 100 civilians, 200 civilians killed every day, along with mass displacement and famine. So the attacks have been kind of continuous. With October 7th, we've been attacked twice in major Washington Post features. And the first one accused us of October 7th denialism. And I think this is the key here to what's going on when you talk about American innocence. We're being accused of October 7th denialism. It was a reporter named Liza Dvoskin. I kind of clowned her by calling her live on a Grayzone live stream and demanding to know how she could accuse us of such a thing when we were publishing facts. And that didn't work out very well for her. But her main source on the article was another one of these censorship industrial complex outfits called the National Contagion Research Institute. And you take a look into what it is. It was founded by a former director of the Anti-Defamation League. So it's the Israel lobby. It has tons of former DHS and FBI spooks on its board. And it's been advised by a former Israeli intelligence officer, Sima Vaknin-Gil, whose job was to defame and attack the Palestine Solidarity Movement inside the United States to attack American citizens on behalf of Israel. That was the Washington Post source. But October 7th denialism, we were attacked again in the Washington Post with all of these spook sources for the same thing, for publishing quote unquote misinformation about October 7th. So what are we doing there that merits so many attacks in such a high profile publication? We are preventing Israel and the Biden administration and the US from consolidating this idea of the October 7th attack as a new Holocaust. That's what they're trying to do. They're already setting up de facto Holocaust museums like a Nova Electronic Music Festival exhibit in New York City, which is like a Clockwork Orange style psychological attack on all visitors to make them hate Palestinians and Hamas to the point where they support what Israel's doing in Gaza. Israel's turning all the southern kibbutzim that were attacked into de facto Holocaust museums. And if they can consolidate this narrative of October 7th, what they can do is then prevent anyone from putting October 7th in historical or political context of an occupied people breaking out of their prison and attacking their occupier, which isn't to say that atrocities didn't occur. They can completely delegitimize the Palestinian cause. But more than that, if they can turn October 7th into the new Holocaust, they can criminalize what they call October 7th denialism, because as we know, Holocaust denial has been criminalized in many countries in Western Europe. In fact, the world's premier Holocaust revisionist, David Irving, spent time in prison in Austria for the crime of denying the Holocaust. And then it also classifies all of us who have tried to bust Israeli propaganda as David Irving, as basically Nazis. And so I think that's our real crime here, is we have prevented them from consolidating that, and therefore we have interrupted and undermined Israeli and American exceptionalism, I think, on a permanent basis. So whatever happens to us, I'm really proud that we made that contribution, because I believe in history. I believe in real politics, in context, and especially critical thinking.
All right. I said I'll let you go after 30 minutes, but this is 41. I want to thank you for doing this. And well, I don't want to go into it, but people should read your book. What's the title again? I forgot. On Israel. I found it.
It's called Goliath.
That's right, of course, Goliath. And what was so profound about that book, because I happened to be there at the 6-Day War, at the end of the 6-Day War. I was in Gaza, I was in the West Bank, and so forth. And if you talk about fake history, my God, nobody ever mentions that there was no Palestinian Air Force, Navy, or Army or anything that attacked Israel. In fact, the 6-Day War was a preemptive war, and that Israel had no trouble. The great Goliath then was supposed to be Egypt, which was really had a third world army and force. Israel had the U.S. behind it with great detail of accuracy in their intelligence gathering and weaponry and everything else. Nonetheless, Israel made peace with Egypt, which had been controlling Gaza. They made peace with Jordan, which had been controlling the West Bank. So the whole I loved about your book is it's a denial of the David Goliath image. Israel was never David. The Palestinians, it's a joke to think of him as Goliath to this day. And so if you want to talk about fake history, that is a core right now. And as a matter of fact, if October 7th hadn't happened, Israel was in the process of embracing Saudi Arabia, which is the center of religious intolerance of this sort, and certainly not having any trouble with Egypt, and so forth. So Goliath, a very important book to demystify the whole subject. I want to thank you for doing this. I want to thank Christopher Ho and Laura Kondarajian at the PBS station KCRW in Santa Monica for hosting these shows. Joshua Scheer, our executive producer, Diego Ramos, who writes the introduction, and Max Jones, who puts up the video, and the JWK Foundation. Hope I'm not making life miserable for them, but in the memory of Gene Stein, one of the rare American public intellectuals and writers who very early on saw that the Palestinians were hardly the Goliath in the situation, and came to the support of Edward Said, one of our great scholars, asserting this opposite view that the Palestinians are human beings like anyone else, entitled to the same human rights as anyone else. So on that note, see you next week with another edition of Scheer Intelligence.